These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands. Groove with the rhythms, get down, get off.
Welcome to Africa World Now Project Collective. I'm your host and producer, James Poe. Today, a river of prophecy, constructing a sacred history of African Americans with Nubia Kai. Africa World Now Project Collective is next. In many circles, it is fully assumed or mythologized that the main or dominant religious institutions have their origins in Africa. A version of African history is used as the entry point of conversations from barbershops to classrooms to generally locate the origins of these dominant religious systems in a generalized or racialized Africa, mostly without any clarity or much needed historiographical or historicity to understand the important particularities, or know enough to know that generalizations or assumptions are not sufficient to satisfy the ethical responsibility to know. Why revisit something that seems to be clear? Because most of what is assumed to be knowledge in this regard is derived from Euro-methodological and epistemic frameworks. What we are attempting to highlight here is the fact that the uses of these methods and frameworks create and often reproduce very dangerous gaps in the processes of knowledge production, gaps that distort and often cause dangerous self-perpetuating crises to reach fully developed conclusions that are essential to developing a well-informed understanding of African and African diasporic experiences on their own terms. The use of these processes, that is, Euro-methodological and epistemic frameworks, carry with them very narrow, culturally derived, politically motivated, economically based assumptions and generalizations. To be clear and hopefully not confuse you any more than you are at this very moment as you're listening to this introduction, attempting to simplify or propose a framing for the conversation that you will hear next. What am I saying? There is a purpose to use what is considered to be dominant frames of knowledge production, the quote approved certifications of what is and is not knowledge, derived from Western Euro-American experiences. There is an interdependent incentive to distort what we know and do not know about an African past. Dr. Nubia Kai, in A River of Prophecy, Constructing a Sacred History of African Americans, suggests that, quote, traditional African history, which differs vastly from Western historical constructs, is generally ignored and dismissed by Western educated scholars, both Black and white. African historical records and genealogies consistently affirm a Cushitic, Kemetic, Hebrew, Canaanite, and Afro-Arab identity and the lines of descent that positions African people as the founders and organizers of the ancient Egyptian and the Judeo-Christian Islamic traditions. These spiritual traditions are linked in a moral and philosophical continuum that flows like a river of prophecy, each tributary leading to a new social and cultural revolution. European scholars of African history have heard the numerous traditional accounts of African ethnicities and their origins from Ethiopia, Egypt or Kemet, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Palestine, Canaan, Mesopotamia, Sumer, Persia, and other nations of what is called the, quote, Old Lands. Without any evidence, they flatly refute these accounts, then proceed to make up an origin for each ethnic group that appeases their intellectual appetite to primitivize and pathologize everything African. The problem is Western educated Black scholars tend to believe this racist scholarship over their own traditional accounts of history, creating a ball of confusion in Black intellectual thought over the question of origins and identity. Dr. Kai's work is an attempt to clear up one of the most confusing and erroneous accounts of African cultural history among Western scholars, the African origins of the Judeo-Christian and Islamic traditions. This history has been obfuscated and reversed in Euro-Western scholarship. and African American intellectuals who are still overwhelmingly dependent on this scholarship unwittingly contributed to its school of errors. While there is acknowledgement that Christianity, Judaism, and Islam have African origins by most African scholars, there still seems to be an assumption that the early Christians, Hebrews, and Arabs were Caucasian, or mixed race, not African. They are intellectually rendered as the, quote, other. What we are saying unequivocally is that the Judeo-Christian and Islamic traditions were originated and developed by Black Africans who were descendants of the ancient Cushitic Kemetic peoples. What we are calling the major Western religions are actually major African-rooted religions. When comparing traditional African and African diaspora accounts of history to modern standard discourses, what we have are two opposing views on the question of indigenous religions of Africa: the African traditional mythological view and the modern Western historical view. The former constitutes a sacred history, that is, a history drawn from myths, scripture, oral and written traditions, folklore, and the production of art. Modern history is in many ways the antithesis of a sacred history. It desecrates myth and scripture with a staunch belief that myths are, quote, lies, relegates African historical narratives to legend, and claims art has little credibility in historical documentation. Traditional written and oral sources of documentation are overlooked, rejected, and even ridiculed by Black scholars with the same short-sightedness of the white scholars they criticize. This rejection and dismissal of African texts is understandable when reading such accounts of cities like Gao disappearing before the eyes of advancing Moroccan soldiers, or of generals moving from one location to another hundreds of kilometers away in a matter of seconds, or of detailed descriptions of jinn, spiritual entities, interacting in the daily affairs of human beings. History, too, is apprehended from the dark feminine realm of the soul, from the symbolic structure of myth designed to speak the language the soul understands, the language of symbols. Ancient historians express themselves through myths because myths were recognized as the highest expression of reality that could be conveyed through the limitation of language. Myth is the perceptive lens of consciousness, recollecting the origin and nature of things and revealing their meaning through an exegesis of symbols. It is a special narrative engendered and interwoven in the collective consciousness of a people. Myth's inextricable relationship with human consciousness and the vital role it plays in enlivening collective experience until recently was misconstrued in Western academia. Both within and without the ivory tower, myth has a popular connotation of a, quote, lie or, quote, fictitious tale. What ancient Africans viewed as truth and infallible was perceived by Westerners as utterly false. Other scholars attempt to explain the ancient comedians' high complex mythology as fictional stories cast in symbolic form is an equally inadequate explanation, for it fails to consider myth as the storehouse of historic consciousness where the true events of the past are preserved. From the modern scholar's view, myth appears irrational, illogical, improbable because they are not seeing myth from the appropriate worldview. For Dr. Kai, however, it is a place rich for study. Dr. Kai first began researching this stream of knowledge in 1987 when she interviewed Dali Siddiqui Diabate, a famous griot, or more appropriately termed jelly, from Mali. Dr. Kai recounts being fascinated by the story and genealogies that he shared. Griots, known as jelly in the Medinke language, have multiple roles as historians, genealogists, artists, cultural and social anthropologists, diplomats, political and judicial advisors, mediators, and officiators of rites of passage ceremony. For nearly 40 years, Dr. Kai interviewed dozens of griots and scholars of griots on the Mali Songhai empires and found that they have a tremendous knowledge of the histories of ancient Egypt, Nubia, North Africa, the Middle East, the rise of Christianity and Islam because they are descendants of these ancient people. For example, in discussing the origins of the Wolof of Senegal, Dr. Kai would ask, what ethnic group did the Wolof descend from? The Jellies answered, they came from Sirere. Who did the Sirere descend from? The Sirere descended from the Salonki. The Salonki descended from the Sonin of Nubia. Over and over, the origins of ethnic groups in North, West, Central, East, and Southern Africa are traced back to the Nile Valley civilizations, the Levant, Mesopotamia, Arabia, along with detailed narratives of their sacred histories. From these studies, it became clear that what we are calling major Western religions are really the major African religions whose original revelations precipitated political and social revolutions that changed the course of African and world history. Adding a bit more clarity, Amadou Hapati-Ba writes in The Living Tradition that, quote, some people tend to wonder whether oral tradition can be regarded as trustworthy. This is hardly the proper question. The value of any testimony depends on the reliability of the informant who, regardless of whether the testimony be written or spoken, is always human. Furthermore, if we trace back the chain of written evidence, we shall find its origins in oral testimony, which lies at the root of all human transmission. In point of fact, when a person recounts an event in writing, he usually refers to a witness. And if he has witnessed the event itself, he usually goes over it in his mind before putting it down on paper. The real problem, therefore, is the value of the person who is testifying, and more specifically of the bond between man and speech. And that bond is strongest in oral society. In societies where writing does not exist, there is an intimate bond between man and the words that are uttered. A written commitment is less constraining, since the word is considered as being the sacred agent of occult forces. It is venerated as such and is handled with caution. These checks and balances guarantee the authenticity of verbal testimony. Knowledge in African oral societies is not something abstract and separate from life. It is bound up with man's tangible social behavior. Through the divine word, it is connected both with the present-day world and with the origin of all knowledge. Amadou Hapati-Ba goes on to write further, quote, the three potential qualities that, quote, God vested in human were knowledge, will, and ability. And for Fudi, the word for speech is derived from the root how, which means to give strength, and by extension, to achieve. It is said of the first man that conversing with, quote, God gave Kikala strength. Indeed, speech, through the vibrations that it sets in motion, activates and propels all things, even material things, just as it prompts anybody whose name is called to turn their head and answer. This is why speech is the main active agent in African magic. The word magic is always used in a pejorative sense by scientists and Europeans generally, whereas in Africa, it simply designates the management of forces, a process that is neutral in itself, but that may prove helpful or harmful, depending on the way in which it is used. As the saying goes, quote, magic and fate are not bad in themselves. It is the use to which they are put that makes them good or bad. Good magic, not the magic of sorcerers, but that of initiates and, quote, masters of knowledge, aims at purifying humans, animals, and objects, so as to restore order among the forces through the agency of speech. Dr. Kai's work asserts that, quote, history is considered sacred in Africa and other indigenous cultures, and that it serves as a spiritual and moral guidebook on how to live right, in harmony with natural and universal laws. Sacred narratives are told through metaphysical language of myth that is understood in African historiography as the highest expression of reality and truth that can be expressed within the limits of language. It is the language of the soul designed to nurture the human back to their initial state of perfection. There is instruction in Egyptian mythology that suggests we have a duty to reclaim the legacies that were stolen from us. To study the, quote, origins of dominant religious systems where billions of people outsource their ethical responsibility to know is a very important task that moves across the artificial boundaries of knowledge. And those who pretend to know do so unaware of the very limits of their knowledge. Not only do they reach mistaken conclusions and make errors, but their, quote, incompetence blinds them of their ability to realize it. Today, we speak with Dr. Nubia Kai, where she applies the science and art of contextualization to the ideas that she is offering to you in her work, A River of Prophecy, Constructing a Sacred History of African Americans. Dr. Nubia Kai received a PhD in African historical literature and film from Howard University and was a former assistant professor in the Department of Theater Arts. As a MA degree candidate in anthropology, she began to specialize in African diaspora folklore. She received a MA degree in African languages and literature from the University of Wisconsin, where she researched the folklore and cultural practices of Hausa women. Her work has been published in Black Scholar, Black World, Essence Magazine, Black American Literature Forum, Catalyst, Obsidian, Moving Out, Journal of Black Poetry, Left Curve, Journal of African Literature Association, Black Camera, International Film Journal, Journal of African American History, to name a few. Her book, Kumi Malinke Historiography, Sondiata Kita to Alamani Samurai Tore, is an extensive study of the mythology, epics, poetry, and expository narratives of the Mali Empire. She has been an ardent researcher of comparative religion, anthropology, mythology, and Africana studies for over 30 years, and has traveled extensively and studied with Jollies in West Africa and beyond. Professor Kai is also a poet, novelist, and playwright who has received a number of awards, including 2 National Endowment for the Arts Awards, 6 DC Commission on the Arts Awards, and the Larry Neal Writers Competition Award. She has 2 collections of poetry, Piece of My Mind and Solos, a collection of fables. The Sweetest Berry on the Bush, and a novel, I Spread My Wings and I Fly, which is a historical novel set in the mid-1850s in southern Louisiana. The novel focuses on the Maroons in the United States, the psychological effects of slavery, and the dynamics of Black culture, folklore, and philosophy. Based on historical documentation, folklore, myths, slave narratives, and ethnographic studies, the novel illustrates through the epic narrative form the rich, varied, and highly metaphysical culture of enslaved Africans, their militancy, self-expression, and their relentless struggle for freedom. The novel reveals the long-suppressed facts of the role of Maroon guerrilla warfare in paving the road to emancipation. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, Ghana, Haiti, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Listen intently, think critically, act accordingly. Enjoy the program. Around this, the use of African methods, methodologies, because a lot of academics who are trained in Euro-Western academies still utilize those particular ideas and concepts to try to map understanding or extract some type of understanding over the long genealogy or the long universe of African history, right? You start your recent project outlining the importance of African methods and methodology, right? So yeah, let's go begin there. Let's just go ahead and, coming into this particular project, why you're doing it, because as we were just saying, as you started the conversation, there's a lot of mischaracterization and misconceptualization of who African people are, but also other people, particularly if you're talking about, the so-called Middle East, that Western colonial construct of the Middle East, and that like that. But yeah, let's just jump in.
So first of all, the name of the book, and I want to emphasize that because I've been talking about the book and then getting no responses. Nobody's trying to buy it because we really didn't talk about it. The book is called A River of Prophecy, Constructing a Sacred History of African Americans. And first, I'm going to explain what is meant by sacred history. In most indigenous cultures in Africa, Asia, and in the Americas among indigenous people, history, that is history, if it is told truthfully, is considered sacred because it kind of presents a sacred text, right, of the cause and effects of human behavior. It becomes like a guidebook on, okay, these are the consequences of these actions on the right. These are the consequences of these actions on the left. We have a choice. We have free will to follow whichever path, but this is the best path, right? And we look within, again, history. And when I was talking about history, I mean a holistic history, the social history, the political history, a psychological history. Because again, history is just told us holistically. So you're getting an anthropological analysis as well as historical one, especially in the griot tradition. And another reason, of course, is because human beings are considered sacred, then their history is also sacred. So it presents a guidebook on how to live right, how to live correctly, how to live in harmony with the other beings, human beings, with other beings, jinns, angels, deities, with animals, with plants within the universe, how to live in harmony with all of these forces. So this is how it's understood. Even when we look at certain texts, the biblical text, much of it is history. John Clark used to talk about that, right? How we're really looking at history that becomes a guidebook. The same in the Bhagavad Gita and other sacred text scriptures, which again are explaining history, and you're looking at the karmic consequences of human behavior. So that is why I'm calling it sacred text. But again, one of the prerequisites is that it is a truthful history, not the history that Napoleon was talking about, where it's history, a bunch of lies agreed upon. But actually, he was speaking to the way in which Euro-Western history has been constructed for a very, very long time. So what I'm trying to do in the book is urge African scholars, modern African scholars, to look more to the traditional methodologies and philosophies of history and traditional sources of history. And one of the things is there are many different differences between, again, the Euro-Western historiography and African historiography. And one of them is the use of genealogies. In African historiography, genealogy is central. And that's why African historians, traditional historians who were they're called griots now, but they're called different names depending on the ethnic group. Among the Mali, the Mandinka, they're called jellies. And then when you get into Senegal and Gambia, because they have another pronunciation, they say Mandingo instead of Mandinka. So in Senegambia, they say Jali. The Fulani say Galwa. The Wolof say Galwa. So each ethnic group has their traditional names for griot. And I want to make a correction on even the term griot. Griot, people think it's a French word. It's not a French word per se. What it was the way that the French pronounced the word Galwa, which is what the Fulani called the griot. And it came out sounding like griot, Galwa. So that's where the griot comes from. And now that's kind of become a term that's used for even modern historians in some cases, especially the creative ones. And one of the things about these traditions of the traditional historians, they have sworn to honesty and truthfulness. And if they step away from that, when I say that, I mean, when they're sworn, that means they have taken an oath. The oaths in Africa, anybody who's lived there for a while knows, are very strong and very binding. And if you break those oaths, there are consequences. So the griots are sworn to truthfulness and honesty in all cases, even if it incriminates you, all right? For example, they have a concept called blameworthy wars, wars of aggression, okay, and wars to enslave people. These are blameworthy wars. So they talk about the blameworthy and the worthy. In other words, you're looking at the good and the bad and the ugly, because you have to look at all of that in order to change and develop and improve human behavior, right? If you don't look at that, then you continue to make the same mistakes, right? History repeats itself when you continue to make the same mistakes. So you have to try and correct the mistakes. So again, you have a history that's based on truthfulness and strong oaths, and also the knowledge of the people, the genealogies, the eponymous ancestors. And so the jellies are knowledgeable in history, in genealogy, in cultural and social anthropology, in politics, because they often function in all of these realms as political advisors, as judicial advisors, as ambassadors, as consuls to the kings and generals and chiefs, as mediators in rites of passage ceremonies, funerals, weddings, puberty rites, and in even mediating in disputes between families. The jellies are called for that as well. So they have this wide range of responsibility because of their knowledge of history, because of their knowledge of genealogy and the relationships between different ethnic groups and peoples that go back maybe even thousands of years. And I'm telling you, I think that you get this because there's been this whole degradation of the jelly tradition by Euro-Western scholars who have reduced them to storytellers. All right, so when you talk about the griot, first thing people say is, oh, they're storytellers. Well, okay, if they're history tellers, I'll say history tellers, but they're not making up stories. They present it as though they're fictions, right? They're poets, they're bards that are just making up stories. And so this is how a lot of us think. Now, they will use what we call storytelling techniques, aesthetic devices, rhythm, poetry, drama, metaphors, symbolism, because they know that aesthetic devices are useful in bringing the person, the audience, into the story almost like viscerally, or it's like they're reliving the story when you use these aesthetic elements. They're very powerful. And that's why they use them in the telling of history. And when you really look at it, even in these cultures everywhere, you find that the novel form, the dramas, and the impact that they have on culture, it's amazing. They have more of an impact because they're speaking to the collective consciousness. They're speaking to the psyche. They're speaking to collective memory. So genealogy is, again, very, very crucial because that is who tells you who you are, where you come from. If you get rid of your genealogy, it's like you're getting rid of your identity. And that's something that has happened, unfortunately, among a lot of modern African scholars. I'm speaking of scholars from the continent who've heard all their life stories about how they're the descendants of Joshua, or like the Game people of Ghana, or the descendants of the Hebrews, which the Bantu-speaking people, all of that is the Hebrew migration back into Africa, or that they're descendants of Solomon and Makeda, Abraham and Noah, who are major eponymous ancestors, even in the diaspora. You will hear that name often. Descendants of Muhammad, Prophet Muhammad. They've been hearing this all their life. But then the Euro-Western scholar comes with his power, with their hegemonic power to control the narrative. And of course, if you go into their universities, you can't use any of this. They come and they make up an origin for them. And then we believe their story and cast off the genealogy that has been handed down by our ancestors. That is what has happened in Africa, unfortunately. What I'm trying to get people to do is no, you have to believe what your ancestors are saying, or at least acknowledge it, at least look at it. They act as though, no, that's not possible, when all the evidence is so obvious in so many ways. So mythology is another subject that I want to get into in terms of our understanding of mythology and how your Western world has twisted and degraded mythology. Mythology is very, very important. And even a lot of us as psychologists and religious, what you call it, people in religion have looked at mythology and written about it and have, I think, adequately explained the function of mythology, like the writings of Joseph Campbell, Baker Finn, W.T. Stevenson, Young. However, there's still this belief that this mythology is fiction, where in African cultures and Asian cultures, indigenous cultures, mythology is understood differently. It's understood as the highest expression of truth and reality that can be expressed within the limits of language. Because they say real truth cannot really even be expressed in words. But through the vehicle of mythology, you get closest to the real truth and reality through mythology. And we're speaking here of what Campbell calls living mythology. The mythology, most cultures have these origin stories, the origins of creation. So you have the origin myths of creation, and then you have the historical myths, which are often told in epics. And then you have etiological tales. There are various levels of mythology, mythological stories, which are different than living mythology. But in living mythology, because this intricate tie to consciousness and historic memory is the key here, and why these cultures still use that, and why, even though we're in a culture that says, well, mythology is fiction, it still shapes a great deal of our thinking. And I really liked the way you had opened the show when we did it several years ago, but that was before the book came out, when you opened up reading the thing that Stevenson talked about in terms of the power of myth. And I want to just kind of go over that here. The essential character of our personal and social lives are shaped by myth, or it is by the power of particular myths which determine, by way of determining our fundamental presuppositions, the way we shape our cultural, social, political, and economic lives. We do nothing of significance which is not informed by myth in a fundamental way. And the more significant our act, the more this is true. It is the symbols within the context of myth which gives rise to all thought. And then you have from Bakofen, J.J. Bakofen, the origins of history can only be revealed through myth, since in myth lies the beginning of all development. And so this is, again, anything dealing with origin. It can be the origin of creation, the origin of the universe, the origin of the human being, the origin of a religion, the origin of a nation, right? The origin of a scientific invention or something. You're getting into myth. Myth is told on several levels, multivalent levels, right? You get the allegorical meaning and the symbolic meaning, but there's also, and even the scientific meaning, but you also have the mystical meaning and a literal meaning. And that's where people, even these scholars of mythology miss the literal part of it, okay? And that goes along with the saying of the development of knowledge. Like if we talk about a mountain, first you see the mountain, and that's all that you see. And then at the next stage, you see the significance, so the symbolic significance of the mountain. You see strength. You see fortitude. You see a yearning for God. You see a yearning for a hope. All right. But the mountain disappears. The next level, you see the mountain again and the symbolic meanings. You see it all completely. So what a lot of these European scholars who've done excellent work, again, on understanding the function, they're at that second stage. You see what I'm saying? And a lot of Afrocentric scholars as well. And that was another reason why I was inspired to read this book when I heard a very famous scholar, Egyptologist, say that Asar and Aset, Isis and Osiris, were fictional characters. And because of the influence, I know it has a lot of impact. And then I was talking to other people, and it's like that most of them had that view that they're fictional characters. And even though they're gods, in many cases, the gods were human beings that lived the life that they talk about, and then they're later deified, right? And that's what you have with Asar and Aset. And that's what you have in much of the mythology that they think is fiction. And it seems like fiction because of all the fantastic elements, but they're actually literally true. That was one of the reasons. And then the famous thing on the conquest of North Africa in Islam, the coming of Christianity. And one of the things I wanted to say about the jellies, because they know most of them descend from the Nile Valley civilizations, and I want to really get into that. They have this vast knowledge of ancient Kemetic and Ethiopian history going back thousands of years. I mean, the laws and things that you can't even find in the archaeological, exploration expeditions that have been going on. A lot of history of ancient Kemet, of the coming of the Christianity, of the Hebrews who were part of the Mali Empire, who later ended up in Ghana as the Akan people. The coming of Christianity, the coming of Islam. You will see that many Afro-Arabs who were from the very beginning of Islam were infused into these West African tribes. The Hausa, the Fulani, the Mandinka, the Soninke, they've been infused and they know those lineages. So you have this, again, this movement. It seems like, and even in the biblical text, they talk about coming up from the Nile Valley, then moving towards the east. right? The population tending to move further toward the east, populating the region of Saudi Arabia, Mesopotamia, ancient Babylon, Sumer, all those regions, all the way into India, because even all of India was inhabited by these same Cushitic Kemetic people. So I'm learning this because I'm like I'm saying, the first time I went and actually interviewed a jelly, and this is what I've been doing for 40 years. I would interview a jelly in Mali, Senegal, Gambia, Burkina Faso, and Guinea, because many of them are spread all over, again, these descendants of the Mandinka. And I would ask them, get into the origins, and that's something, again, their specialty is the origins. So, for example, the Wolof people, I'd ask the Galois, what is the origin of the Wolof people? And where did they come from? What were they called before they were Wolof? They were called the Serer. Well, what was the Serer called? Before, where did the Serer come from? The Serer came from the Soninke. So where did the Soninke come from before they were Soninke? They came from Sonin. Sonin, and they tell me the location. The Sonin came from Aswan. And the name Aswan in Egypt, in Upper Egypt, was the Nubian area. In Upper Egypt, at that time, it was called Sonin. Soninke means people of Sonin. And they migrated around the first century when Christianity was spreading. They migrated from Sonin to the region around, they say, the Senegalese River, around Mauritania and Senegal, in that region. And that was, I guess you could say, the seat of power, the center of where they would sit. The Ghanaian or Ouagadougou Empire was established, the Empire of Ghana. And what they also told me, these were the Soninke griots. They're called Gesir, or Jara. These Gesirs were explaining this to me, how they moved from, and this has been documented also in books where they're publishing just direct narrations from the jellies. They're doing that a lot in press. They don't do it much here. But they told me when they came that they were Christians. They said Ghana was a Christian empire. Now, never heard anything like this. And I'm going to be honest, I was like, I didn't take it like real seriously, kind of like, okay. Then later on, I end up reading from a very reliable source. And this is a guy that they call Abu Bakr ibn al-Aziz, al-Jahiz. Noka Rashidi used to talk about him. He's called the father of Arabic letters, but he wasn't an Afro-Arab. He was from Babylon, probably, again, of Ethiopian origin, because I'm going to explain how we all really go back to Ethiopia, right? And he was writing in the 9th century. And in his book, again, highly reliable source in the Eastern and Western world, right? And he said, and I was able to document that, that's in the book, that the Soninke were Christians and established a Christian empire until the time of, I think, after the conquest around the 10th century, around to 1066, they were Christians. And their sphere of influence, contrary to what the Euro-Western scholars said, because for them, Ghana was just that region in Mauritania and Senegal, which was just the center, right? Kumosali in Ghana were located there. But they said the sphere of influence went from the Atlantic Ocean all the way across the Sahel and the Savannah to the Nile Valley. The Nile River extended that far, because that's where they're coming from. It actually went all the way back to Sonin. And again, unlike the Europeans, they didn't force Christianity on anybody, but you did have Christians throughout the empire, as well as other religious traditions. And then when I put it together, because we know the Christianity, even though they tried to change that story, started in Palestine, which at that time was all Black, swept through North Africa, which was predominantly 90-something% Black, and it included the region of Nubia and Meroe in that area in Ethiopia. So we know that they were there, and it's like it made sense, and then you start collecting the dots. If the Soninke people came from Sonin and it was Christian in that time, and they came to West Africa, wouldn't they bring their religion with them? You see what I'm saying? So then it's like, okay, but I was not able to even use that in my dissertation even though my advisors came from that region. Well, Wolof, right, with the descendants. But I mean, they know that even the scholars, they couldn't put that there. So I couldn't even use it, even though I'm talking about, I was focusing on the Mandinka tradition, but of course, the Mandinka tradition came from the Soninke, right? So, and then the Soninke came from Kemet. So actually, the Mandinka tradition itself goes back to ancient Kemet. And, in my dissertation, I talk about the actual person who brought it, again, because this is what the jellies explained to me, and the contribution that he made in establishing this tradition in West Africa. So, and I mean, when they say that we only use 1/10 of our brain, you'll believe it when you see the knowledge that they're able to hold in their heads verbatim. I mean, enough to literally fill a library. That's what they're able to, and I guess they have different methods and ways of doing that, but they're doing it. And they're studying from the time they're children, because again, traditions are within families pretty much now. And so from the time you're a child, you're learning that tradition, and you actually are not able to explicate it though until you're 40 years old. So it's a lot of time, a lot of training, a lot of traveling. I was able to interview, remember Jimo Koyate, who had the African dance group for a long time. He taught at the University of Maryland. He was one of the main sources I interviewed. This man had an amazing amount of knowledge. And one of the things about the jellies, even though they're telling the same story, they all may have had a different approach and were able to add something different, right, to the narrative. In every case, they were able to add something different. So between him and another jelly by the name of Bakary Somono, who was the head jelly in Mali, I spoke to them at great length, and they explained how the tradition, how it was started, also how it was degraded under colonialism. I don't want to get too far away from the text, but I'm just saying that they really, really, and this is why I think the Euro-Western scholars tend to degrade them. They act like, that's no big deal. It is a big deal to me. When you have that kind of memory, you have, Jim was talking about Tumani Giabatti, the choral player, how he has 5,000 songs that he has in his head. But even then, he can sing, but he's not able to talk about the history, because even when I was interviewing him, he was 39. He wasn't 40 years old. And even earlier, when I first interviewed his father back in the 80s, he was still a kid, but he was learning the tradition even then. So anyway, again, the fact that you had a Christian empire in West Africa, in North Africa, and when you look at the genealogies and the movements of peoples, you will see that our people were Christian and Muslim centuries before the Europeans appropriated those traditions. And one of the reasons why mythology is so important is because it explains so many things. Again, the four functions of mythology. And one of the most important mythologies to me, in my mind, of the African experience, Black experience, is the myth of Asar and Aset. That was another reason it disturbed me when people were saying, they're fictional. Here you have the longest and most popular ritual ceremony in Kemet is in Abydos at the temple of Asar and Aset. And I mean, these were rituals that were going on almost every day, flagellations and other things, drama, the music. This is where opera really started, because the story was all told through music. And you think that they're there for people that did not exist, that are fictional? You know what I'm saying? Does that make any sense? You think this is Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox that they're going and honoring somebody, but yet that's what people believe. That's what they call the Aristotelian interpretation of mythology. Because, Aristotle and Plato and them, they looked on the Greeks. The Greeks literally believed in the stories, the Iliad and the Odyssey and the others, right? And they're saying, that's just foolishness. The people, they're primitive minded, da-dee-da. And that's how we're still looking at, that's how they still look at it in the Western world. And that's another thing, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the story of the Mycenaeans. When I say you got to study everybody, it was about Black folks, Black people, right? Homer was Black. And I've read articles about that. Homer, how do we know Homer was Black? Because of his genealogy. He was Pelasgian. Pelasgian Greeks were from Canaan. They were Canaanite. The Canaanites were Black. And he's talking about, in the Iliad and Odyssey, he's actually talking about some of his ancestors were part of that. So all of the stories, and I really haven't read them, and I know a lot of people have, but all of the fantastic elements and all of those things, that is literally believed by the people. But the people with the Aristotelian interpretation, and many even of the Afrocentric scholars who think Asar and Aset are mythical, and even some of them are saying Jesus and Muhammad, they think they're fictional people, right? That's the situation, right?
There's so much here. Can you pick back up on the people, and then of course the myths and the traditions that come out of that particular part? I just wanted to make one note, particularly for the Mycenaeans. It's very interesting because I've looked at that particular history, but one of the things I did notice, and it always perplexed me, was there was this mythicism, or there was kind of not a mythicism, or a confusion about who they were, which allowed me to actually look and see they had to be Black because they had to be African. Right. They had to be, because when you have this kind of like narrative that is, confusing, or they're saying there's like some things that they don't know, that means that they do know, they just don't want to say in that particular context. I just want to make that note, because every time I hear anything about the Mycenaeans and, the civilization that created, the other Greek civilization, all of those is like, oh, well, we don't know. No, you just don't want to. The name of your book is The River of Prophecy. And if those who are actually get a chance to read, grab it and read it, what you're doing is tying together multiple streams of history, which is very, very important. But you're using an obviously African methodological, the Jalis, the Domus, how history is not just something that needs to be taught. It's something that needs to be lived in the context of finding truth. And so what is interesting about narratives around Black history or African history, you hear people say right now, they don't want to teach us history, or they want to get rid of our history and all of that other stuff. This methodology that you present, but also let me just make this note. If people have followed your research, you have been developing this over the course of your work. I would just want to make sure, because you see these elements evolving from the first book, from the novels that you wrote. You see this process that you are practicing, this notion of history as truth, as an ethic, as a moral embodiment of memory. You've been talking about Christianity, you talked about Islam. Could you talk a little bit more about the Islam or the Christianity from, African indigenous? It moves out and then it comes back as something else. Could you talk a little bit more about that particular history and why that is important to pay attention to in the context of practice, in the context of truth, in the context of what we should be as human beings?
Yeah. Okay. The history going into Christianity, when we really look closely at what was going on socially at the time, when the Romans and then later the Byzantines come in and take power, even before them, the Greeks. But one thing you can say about the Greeks is that they did give attribution to where they got their knowledge. Aristotle talked about how math, the Egyptians invented math and did astronomy and this and that. Herodotus, when you look at Herodotus' history, it seems that most of the, quite a bit of the history is about Egypt and these other Black civilizations, far more than is about Greece. So they give attributions to all the knowledge that came from Kemet to Greece, and they really admired the Egyptians. The Greeks really admired them and looked up to them, because for a long time, that was the spiritual and intellectual center of the world. But when the Romans come in, the Romans seem to be different. And I'm not saying the Greeks were not racist, because they were. And one of the things that they established under the Ptolemaic dynasty was the separation of races. It was really, can envision a Jim Crow system or system like apartheid. That's the way the system was in North Africa, along with the forced labor system under the serf system. So the whites who were there lived in their own enclaves. Black people were not allowed to go there. They were not allowed to intermarry. They had draconian laws against intermarriage. And they, again, huge taxes and a labor force, again, where that was pretty much, they brought the serfdom of Europe into North Africa. And, you know, they had gotten rid of slavery in Europe because one of the popes said, well, look, we can actually profit more from a system in which we don't have any of the overhead. We're not responsible for their food, their clothing, and shelter, right? You still have a forced labor system, but now you have to take care of yourself. That's why colonialism was more profitable than slavery. And eventually, slavery was ended through attribution because of the profitability of the colonial structure. You're getting the same amount of work, but you're paying much less. So this is what they did in Europe, and they brought that system into North Africa, particularly against the indigenous Black people of North Africa. And so what the Christian movement was, and I look at it as a movement, as a social, political, economic, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist movement against Roman, Byzantine, and then the Vandals and Visigoths were in there also, against their imperialism. And they did it using the message of Christ. And you know how you have, again, Christian ministers like Brother Albert Clegg, Brother Jeramogi, who started the Black Christian Nationalists. And he was a very knowledgeable theologian as well. We tell you his message was to liberate Black people. And that's why he said, stay away from the Gentiles. Don't have anything to do with them. Be as far away from them as the heaven is from the earth. And he emphasized this self-reliance, right? Self-reliance. You know, let's deal with our own sources, use our own names. When the Romans come in, you notice all these Latin names that they start forcing on people. They started telling them how to dress, telling them how to eat, telling them how to worship, right? They're supposed to worship Jupiter. You know, Jesus was saying, no, don't do any of that, resist. And I think of Amilcar Cabral's statement, to live your culture in an oppressed society is itself a revolutionary act. That's what Jesus' message was. And it actually was much closer to what Garvey was talking about rather than Martin Luther King, right? Where you have more of this Pauline Christianity, right? And it's interesting that everything that Paul did was the thing that Jesus said not to do, right? When he said, don't associate with the Gentiles, stay away from them. He said, I have not come to talk to the Gentiles. I have come to talk to the lost children of Israel. By that time, you had mass numbers of people after the breakup of the two kingdoms migrating back into Africa. So that's what he was talking about. And so they were able to, it was this Holy Spirit was almost something that was tangible, right? We read about how people would go into the lion. People would get the Holy Spirit. They didn't care. You'd take me into the lion's den. The lions couldn't even touch them because they were imbued with the Spirit. They had to bring the Roman soldiers out to cut them down. And then the story about the man who everybody, what they did to kind of end the oppression or challenge it was they started taking their resources and putting them together. So you had some Black Christians who were doing well, even though most were not doing well. But what happened when they put all of their resources together and redistributed it equitably, they were able to get rid of poverty. Well, this Holy Spirit was of such power that people who were holding back, there was a story in there, this man and his wife were holding back. They had a lot of money, but they didn't want to put their money in with the rest. And because they didn't do it, the Holy Spirit killed them right away. So it's these kinds of situations. And then this is another reason why people don't believe these histories. They call them fiction because of then kind of the miraculous element to it. And I mean, it was really sweeping very quickly because here in Sonin, you had it in Sonin in the first century, and they're coming from Sonin and going to West Africa. And it's again, and of course, all of North Africa, mainly among the Black Africans. And I want to say the groups that we're talking about during this period, they were called Moors, but they didn't have power. And the Moors, they were called Moors from the term Mauritania, because the Romans, the way they divided up the colony was the Mauritania, Tripolitania, Mauritania, Caesarea, like that. So collectively, they were called Moors, and it was spelled Maurs. And for them, it meant just simply Black people. The Moors made up, and after talking to, again, numerous jellies, in where did this person come from, that one, and in the Bantu-speaking peoples, we mainly go back to Nile Valley cultures. And I put it kind of like this. Ethiopia was the beginning, the mother, the female principle. Nubia, the father, the male principle, the active principle. This is where you get the development of the sciences and the arts and agriculture and husbandry and all that. And then Kemet is the child. So that's the trunk of the tree. Then you have the Hebrews, who the eponymous ancestors Abraham, and these are names that you will find orally through the jellies, but also in written documents throughout Africa. I'm talking about millions in Africa and in the diaspora. Abraham, major figure, and Noah. Noah, in this sense, is conflated with Asar. They're actually, and there's a pastiche in Genesis where they're actually like the same people. It's telling the same Asar Aset myth, but they're using the name Noah. And I know this can be a little confusing because you were talking about a large periods, and a lot of times these genealogies, because they're thousands of years, they're condensed. So you might see an eponymous ancestor, and then they'll go down to another 300 years, or maybe 1,000 years, right? But you still get these major eponymous ancestors, which constitutes this river of prophecy, or what Cornell West calls the Black Messianic tradition. Okay, through Noah, through Abraham, through Solomon, through David, through various prophets, Jesus. And they'll tell you, like in the Quran, it says, and this is nothing but the same message that was brought to Noah and Abraham and Jesus and done. And the message was, did you not make division in religion? Right. And I talk about that in the various traditions because you had something similar going on in India. Where they're dealing with the damages and of the social damages and degradation of the Sudras and the Dalit, the untouchables in India. So you had the Krishna movement and you had the Buddhist movement. These were also similar Black movements against European colonialism, but that is what Christianity was. And they did speak in those terms. When he said, stay away from the Gentiles, this is for the lost children of Israel. It was a racial element to all of this. And in fact, the reason why the guy who led the movement from Sonin to West Africa and brought Christianity, it was because of this thing about not interracial marriages, right? In other words, he wanted to marry a white woman. Okay, I mean, I'm not letting myself credit, but again, these draconian laws. I'm not saying that that's the answer to our problems, okay, what some people think, but that was one of the reasons, okay, as well as other things. It was just the general oppression in general. And the idea was to come to the other side of Africa to establish an empire that would be a fortress against further encroachment into sub-Saharan Africa. So the Ghanaian Empire, and when I talk in the book about benign empires, it was a benign empire in that sense, and that was one of the reasons why they went there. And they had an army that it was larger than the Roman army of 300,000 people. And again, they're stationed across the Savannah and the Sahel, from the Atlantic to the Nile, a Christian empire. So it's clear, and again, these are all in the genealogies as well. It is clear that we were the early Christians. And you see it in a lot of images that are still there. You talked about the Mycenaeans and stuff. Actually, in Turkey, My goddaughter went to Turkey on a trip, and she said all the people in Turkey were Black. And when she asked them about it, it's like, well, we don't know. All these Black figures of Troy, and they're talking about these things that happened that you read in the Iliad and Odyssey, and all the people are Black. The same thing with Persia. That's another story there. But the Black empires, benign empires, because we never heard of benign empires, right? We're so accustomed to European imperialism, which is a predatory imperialism. But you can have a benign empire, a good empire. And especially when you think of a very powerful nation or empire that can do great damage, okay, to smaller nations. Being part of a larger empire could be a good thing because they're going to protect you from a large, powerful group, oppressive group coming and attacking you. And that was the purpose in many of these cases, right? That was the purpose, particularly in Islam, when you have, with the Christians, once again, the Christians were able to resist through a kind of a cultural revolution, imperialism and oppression of the Roman Byzantines, Visigoths. But once the Europeans adopted Christianity, we know about that, Council of Nicene, Constantine has this vision that if he adopts Christianity, that he will be able to gain control of the entire empire. It was a fight between Byzantine and the Western Roman Empire, the Eastern and Western. And sure enough, when he did that, he did take control. And then later on, all of Europe becomes Christian. But this is 4 centuries after it had already swept through Africa. But what did they do with it? They just kind of took on the ecclesiastic drapings of Christianity, but still practice a kind of antichrist. I mean, we can really say from the time the Europeans, especially in the leadership, I'm not saying this about all the people, but certainly in the leadership, from the time they appropriated this religion, this Black liberation religion, they became the antichrist, right? Mm-hmm. So there was a need for another movement, another prophet, another sage, another one who would take the people further. So you're getting, in African systems, divination is a big deal, right? Even in international relationships and wars, just like the I Ching was used in China. They use that in Africa as well. So there were already pamphlets being circulated that there was a prophet coming from the East. So they were expecting this. So when the Arabs come in a very short time, they come in and are able to take down Egypt. Why were they able to take down Egypt? Because they were joined by all of the Black Christians who were there. So when they say it was a Muslim takeover, what it really was, you had the Afro-Arab Muslims and all of these Christians who made up these 5 groups that constitute pretty much all of Africans. The Ethiopian, Nubian, Egyptian, again, same line. The Hebrews, coming from the extended family of Abraham, when he leaves Sumer and comes into Kemet, it was during the 12th dynasty of the Middle Kingdom that they come in to Kemet. The pharaoh Sesostris or Senusret gives his daughter to Abraham. They call her a slave. No, she was a queen. And in the Kebra Nagas, the Ethiopian Book of Kings and the Ethiopian history, they tell you that she was the princess, she was a queen. In their version of the book, right? She was a queen, and that's why not a slave, right? And of course, that's also the burial place where she's buried in the Kaaba in Mecca. That is the burial place of Hajar. So the Hebrews are really just a branch of the Egyptians. When they went into Kemet and stayed as an extended family during the 12th dynasty, they have the same DNA haploid of the people from the 12th to the 20th dynasty, because that's what they are. So in the book, I will use the term African Hebrews or Egyptian Hebrews because that's what the original Hebrews were, with these Bantu-speaking people all over where they actually descend from. Then you have the Arab, the Afro-Arab. 85% of Saudi Arabia is Black. We don't even know it. We think it's an all-white country. It's 85% Black to this day, has been Black. But when the British came in 1921 and took over as a protectorate, they brought in these kind of white-looking Arabs from Jordan and from Turkey. And that's the princes that you always see on outskirts of Saudi, like Bahrain and Kuwait and Qatar and other places. You see the royal families are still black. Like remember the brother who was the prince of the king of Kuwait when Saddam Hussein was in power, right? That's how the royal family looks. That's how the family looked in the Hijaz. That's the reason when Mecca and Medina and all the place. I had pictures on my PowerPoint. Dark-skinned black people that were there in 1921 that they pushed them out. And they presented as though, again, it's like they're very deliberate in doing that, right? But the Arabs are simply Nubians and Ethiopians, especially in Yemen. That was part of Ethiopia. And in fact, the Ethiopian Empire, when I talk about benign empires, that was one of the earliest and largest. And I was teaching in Ethiopia back in 2020. And I learned that empire had extended, like it was kind of in the middle. It took over all of Saudi Arabia, included all of Babylon, of Iraq, Palestine, Lebanon, and Kemet, and Sudan, half of Sudan, and Ethiopia. That's how extensive, and parts of Persia. That's how extensive it was. All of Saudi Arabia, Palestine, Syria, with the present day Iraq, which was like ancient Babylon, but all of that region, including Kemet in Ethiopia, was huge. In the Kibber Nagas, the Book of Kings, Nimrod, remember Nimrod in the biblical text, who built the Tower of Babel. Tower of Babel so high they couldn't even see the end of it. He's listed as an Ethiopian king who was part of that empire. That was in 34 something BC, right? But the king, this actually starts with Asar, who is also called Ori, in the king's list at 4400 BC. That's 1200 years before the supposed unification of the two lands in Kemet, right? With the Palette of Narmer, right? So you had that again before. We have to go back really to Ethiopia. And again, Kemet and Nubians and Kemetans are just descendants of Ethiopia. So it's really a very appropriate name in a sense, right? So our people, after doing this research with the jellies, and again, this stuff is not just in oral. People, just like people here would have their genealogies in the Bibles and stuff, and on different, in quilts and other things, right? They have these genealogies, except they're much larger because they're going back thousands of years, right? Including a lot of people. They will have them written down in book. Families have these genealogies. That's how they keep them. In fact, that's where the jellies get the histories from. They go to these families. They do extensive traveling and collecting. But one of the things about genealogies, it's hard to, they say, oh, people can make it up. And that's what they always say, right? When the Europeans come and they have these genealogies, they say, oh, well, they're just saying they come from him. They're just trying to make themselves feel important. And like I say, and unfortunately, we've taken that view. They're just trying to feel important. That's why they're saying they're Hebrews. That's why they're saying they came from Akkad. That's why they're saying, and so we push that aside. And that is another reason, like I said, I wanted to get on this program. I hope people in the audience who may be here and have heard these things all their life will reconsider what's being said. But another problem is, especially when we talk about the Arabs and Hebrews, I want to also mention the Canaanites. Okay, let me go back. Ethiopia, Nubia, Kemet, Hebrew, Canaanite. That's another. The Canaanite, in the Egyptian Kemetan text, they talk about their cousins. Okay, again, one of the descendants of Noah. That's a major group. The Jebusites, Amorites, and others that were originally living in Lebanon, but then were all across North Africa. Today, they're called the Berber, right? And you see many Berbers of lighter complexion. You see now North Africa and the Middle East, Iran and Syria and all these places that were all black, now much lighter. But that's something that occurred It's fairly recent through white slavery. That's another subject. So what you have with the people had asked about, well, where did the white Arabs come from? Many of them, they came in like during the Crusades, right? When they're coming in to take Jerusalem, and they start coming into these regions. Many of them did not go back, especially when you keep losing wars. They didn't go back. So they stayed and adopted the religion, adopted the culture and the language, and you think that they're the actual people. And then the whole history of the Ashkenazi Jews, and I think that that's part of the problem in that region. One of the major problems is they know they're not the real people, or at least the people in that region know that. Because when they came back saying, okay, we're going to take our land and this is then given to us, and Gabriel Nasser said, we will never accept you because you left here as Black people and you come back as white people. So they know the deal. And that's what hurts them to there, because they want to be the real people, but something in them that, you know what I'm saying? And it could be that they're descendants. As you had the Hebrews going everywhere, you had them emerging because they say they came from a people called the Khazars, and the Khazars were Black. If the Khazars were Black, they could very likely be a Hebrew group, you know, but look at how they're acting, you know.
Yeah.
So, well, I guess I know I've been jumping around, but when you were talking about, again, Christianity and then Islam, what I want to make clear is that these early Christians and Muslims were African, right? Again, coming from those 5 or 6 groups, you want to say, from the Ethiopia, Nubia, Kemet, was basically the same, Canaanite, Hebrew, Afro-Arab. And the thing, too, when you go further and further into the Middle East, because I didn't get to talk about Sumer and Elam and what happened there, because I was teaching over in Ethiopia in 2020, and I intended to go to India and Iran and Israel, Palestine, I'll call it Palestine. And COVID broke out. So I wasn't able to finish that research to get the story there, because Persia was another major Black empire that did a lot of good, and I talk about that in the book. The early Christian movement, the Islamic revolution, the Moorish civilization that was established under the Umayyad and Abbasid, they would be under benign imperialism because they broke up those lands that the Europeans had taken over and redistributed. Even the Spanish, white Spanish, preferred their rule because they had power under their rule, as you know, not to mention all of the different inventions. So this prophecy, river of prophecy, you see it continuing through, again, the Christian tradition and then the Islamic tradition through the emphasis on seeking knowledge, whether from the cradle to the grave, seeking knowledge if you have to go to China. And that's what they started doing. They went to China, they went to India, they went to Kemet, they went to Ethiopia, you know, they went to the ancient Canaanites, the Carthaginians, those were the Canaanites, and got their texts and studied them and translated them. And then built on that knowledge and just came up with just tremendous amount of inventions in science and astrology and mathematics and agriculture. I mean, you name it. And when I really look at it, to me, it looks like an incarnation of ancient Kemetic culture of the Old Kingdom, all right? Even in terms of the character, when they talk about the character of the Kemetic people, you saw the character of the Moors being the same. The liberation of women, you find that going on in early Christianity and in Islam. As horrible as it is now, because you see how they flip the script. And when they flip it all the way back. So one of the things I want to say on this takeover, how the Europeans have taken over our legacy, is told in the myth of Asar and Aset. That's why I say that is a very, very important myth, because it explains what's been going on in some ancient times to modern times. It explains the past and the present. And that's another thing about mythology. You get a view of the past, the present, and the future. So in the myth of Asar and the meaning of Asar, according Francis Cress Welsing is the God of the perfect black, the God of the perfect black, who was very tall, very handsome, who was a creative genius, who goes around the world teaching the arts and sciences to the world. So he's teaching agriculture, animal husbandry, medicine, astrology, astronomy, mathematics, chemistry, alchemy, you name it, all of the various arts, metallurgy. And in this sense, Asar represents simply Black people because women were actually also involved in a lot of these inventions that are attributed to Aset as well as Asar, like the invention of medicine and a lot of other things that the women did. He's invited back. He goes around the world and he comes back to this feast where his brother Set, who, by the way, has white skin and red hair. Now, Set represents this embodiment of evil, and Set becomes Satan and Shaitan in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Okay, but in just human form, he has kind of this amorphous face, but he has white skin and red hair. He's jealous of his brother. And so he plans to kill him, and he puts him in this casket and then throws him in the river. Then Aset finds the casket and takes it to Persia and buries it. And then Set finds that out and then cuts the body up into, some versions say 14 pieces, some say 16 pieces, some say 42, the number of the gnomes that you have. But whichever it is, the idea that it's been severed, it's been cut up. And of course, Aset is the one that's going around and finding parts of his body everywhere. She builds this, these tekens or monuments are found, obelisks, right, are built, which you find all over Kemet today. So again, even in the monuments, you see that they are real, okay, to the Egyptian people and not fictional. So the idea is that Set kills Asar and then takes the credit for being king, takes his heritage and takes the throne. In other words, he steals his legacy. But the son that was conceived through immaculate conception named Horus or Heru, and all of us are this is when you get this symbolism, all of us are like Heru. All right, or enjoying to be like Heru. The role of Heru is to avenge his father's murder by Set. And there's a difference between revenge and avenge, right? Where avenge is you're seeking justice, not a bitter thing. You're seeking justice because you know it would continue. To avenge his father's murder and to reclaim the heritage that was stolen. That's why we have to reclaim Christianity and Islam as African traditions. If it was started by African people, if it was organized by African people, if it was appreciated by African people, it's African. It doesn't matter if they've stolen it. Like in Tazaki's song, they say, just because you stole it don't make it yours, it just makes it stolen. And when they steal it, they distort it, they change it, they hijack it. Look at the position of women in Islam today, especially in Middle East places like Afghanistan, and what they were doing under Black Islam, under the Moors. And when people ask the question, who were the Moors were these same 5-6 groups that I've been saying, Ethiopian, the Sahajin, and see in the book, I also have the appendix where I show the major African ethnic groups and where they go back to, and you see where they're going back to a combination of one of these groups, right? Ethiopian, Nubian, Egyptian, and often I just do Ethiopian, Egyptian, because again, there's just one group line, mother, father, child. Hebrew, Canaanite, Afro-Arab, and I should put the Canaanite before because they're older than the Hebrew. They were there in very ancient times. But that's pretty much what we are comprised of throughout Africa. From South Africa, where you have mainly Bantu-speaking people who are largely, again, Egyptian Hebrew. Throughout West Africa, again, these same groups, Egyptian. Sheikh Joe was good at pointing that out. Egyptian, but Hebrew, Afro-Arab mixture there. the Yaroba originally came from Saudi Arabia, then they're in Meroe. So they are Christians. When they come to that region in Nigeria, they're coming as Christians, even though the religion was different. And then you had a Black Hebrew group called the Bafour, who were kind of driven away during the time when they were driving the Moors back into Africa around the 13th century. They come around and they end up coming from Morocco. They end up joining up with the Yoruba people. And they claim they came to that region because originally that's where they were from. But you will find, again, these genealogies in the oral texts, again, as from the jellies, memory, but also in written texts all over, because in books like Tariq al-Futash and the Tariq al-Sudan, it's also, genealogy is also central in those texts. So you have long lists of genealogies in the Tariq al-Futash and the Tariq al-Sudan. In almost any book on history written, by indigenous people, by the jellies and scholars, you will have these long genealogies. Again, because you get rid of your genealogy, you're getting rid of your identity.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to I'm actually just sitting here and just following and there's so much here, but I think it's a good point for us to actually pause because we want to make sure all of this is in the book, the ideas, the framework. And one of the things I think that is super important in the context of your work is that you're following, the tradition of knowledge and memory, not, again, as you mentioned, just as oral tradition, but also as written tradition, as embodied tradition, and all forms of knowledge. I just wanted to ask this one question because I think this, is still going to be important. You mentioned, you talked about the benign empires, and this becomes important, especially when you talk about, of the Moors on the Iberian Peninsula, which is obviously called Al-Andalus. Before then, these incubators become important. These benign empires that have these traditions, these spiritual, historical, political, and social traditions, Islam, Christianity. You find that there is, particularly in African indigenous or African understandings of spirituality, of religion, these things move in and out of each other, right? These concepts of these spiritual systems are interdependent. And what you're trying to do is to show that interdependence through a historical lens, because everything has been kind of distorted, has been moved over here, but you're trying to move it back into a genealogy. Could you talk just a little bit more, specific on the relationship between Islam and Christianity? We talked about their origins, we talked about the people, but what about the principles, the ideas? Because it comes from Africa. It is African, absolutely, traditions. Could you talk a little bit more about, Christianity and then its relationship to Islam and, of course, Judaism itself?
I think in the case with Christianity and Islam, and what makes it differ from other African traditions, is that it was a Pan-African movement. So it was a movement in which many different diverse ethnic groups that had different spiritual practices were united under Christianity. And the goal was, again, to take down European predatory imperialism, right? That again had people in these horrible conditions that they were living in North Africa. Now, again, Christianity, they're changing their condition through, I guess you could call it a kind of cultural revolution of self-reliance, kind of on the scale that Garvey was trying to do, But actually, they also encourage literacy because they wanted people to be able to read the Bible. And some of your first hospitals were started in the churches. So it's a whole kind of benign thing. Help your brother. You are your brother's keeper. And like I say, the economic system that they were trying to develop within the belly of the beast was one of what you would call maybe pure communalism or communism, where everything was shared equally. And in that way, they were able to eliminate poverty. But what happened once the Europeans adopted Christianity, almost 4 centuries later, They come back and they still have this power, this hegemonic power over the North Africa, and I should say over the Middle East as well, which was still, they called them the Saracens, also called them the Moors as well. The blacks in North Africa and the blacks in the Middle East. It was also predominantly black. But again, the conditions under which they lived was of oppression. They introduced the serf system. They had high taxes. So they're fighting this through, again, this cultural, social change within their own communities. But then the Christians still put them taxes on them. Then they started, because of the success that they were making, that's when the persecution started around the 2nd, 3rd century, when they start throwing them in the lion's den and crucifying them. I mean, they crucified thousands, hundreds of thousands of Christians were crucified. These were all black. Or even dropping them in molten lead. And they stood up to that. They were, again, possessed with this Holy Spirit, and it meant nothing to them. But they were not able to break the hegemonic power of the Europeans. They're just being slaughtered and feel like, they're in paradise because they've made this sacrifice. They're martyrs. Then it's around the same time I told you about the prophecies that were coming, that you found, all right? So that's when the Afro-Arabs, when they find, and there was fighting going on in Saudi Arabia between, again, Hebrews and Christians. In fact, there was almost a world war. But this is even before it was adopted by the Europeans. When Christians and Hebrews were all black, there was fighting among them, right? But through the movement of Islam, you had the unification of the Arabs, who were able to drive out the Byzantines, who were kind of encroaching on the north. But as you see, it's always been more difficult for people to control these large desert areas for whatever reason. So once, again, they get the word, and the word is that they're going to take this movement and unite all of these African people. So just like Jesus said, I have come to speak to the Hebrew, the lost tribes of Israel, with Muhammad, and this is written in the works of the person I was telling you about, the father of our letters, Al-Jahiz. Islam is for the blacks and the reds. And in Al-Jahiz's works, he makes very clear who he's talking about when he's talking about the blacks, Arabs, Hebrews, all these other people. And the reds, I think, were people in the far, far east. This is for the blacks and the reds. It's not for white people. It's for the blacks and the reds against European oppression. And see, the thing is, because I say it's a social political movement, but we have to remember at this particular period in history, you didn't see like the separation between the sacred and the profane, right? So any political and social and economic movements were undergirded by spiritual movement, spiritual ethical movement. So that's what was undergirding both of these movements, which constitutes that river of prophecy that, or like it in the Quran, I'll read it, says, and this is nothing but the same message. Let me see if I can find it, of a series of warners of old. The same religion has he established for you as that which he enjoined on Noah, that which we have sent by inspiration to thee, and that which we enjoin on Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, namely that ye should remain steadfast in religion and make no divisions therein. We shouldn't even be calling ourselves Muslims, Christians, or so forth, although that's inevitable when you start organizing, right? But we need to understand that these are it's coming from the same prophecies. It's coming from that same Black Messianic tradition that Cornel West is talking about. And that's why how we should look at it. Not as white people that cut our heads off, or not as people who didn't exist, but they're just fictional characters of myths. And some of our scholars think that as well. So that's the connection. You will see a lot of the same. The Muslims also believe in Jesus, except they don't believe the thing about the begotten son, which was the thing that they did at the Nicene Conference, right? That's when that was put in there. That was something European put in. They say, no, all God has to do is say be and it is. So you don't have to have, it's a begotten son. That's the thing that's challenged. The idea of him being a Messiah, that is believed in Islam, you know? So that's a connection there. And also the connection when the Arabs came to Egypt, they took Egypt in 6 years. They took down the Byzantine Empire. How did they do it? These Afro-Arabs, the Muslims couldn't have done it alone. When they say it was a Muslim conquest, actually the majority of the people who were fighting in that army, 75%, were Christian Canaanites, Christian Hebrews, because a lot of the early Hebrews became Christians, and they still kept their a lot of the Hebrew iconography and symbols and books, right? But they were Christian. The Bafour that I was telling you about, who became part of the Yoruba people, they were Hebrews who became Christian during the Christian era. You had a lot of that. Canaanites, again, most of the Arabs, even though they had Arabs who were there before, had migrated there, but now the Arabs coming from Saudi Arabia are coming with Islam. Theologically, the only difference is the question of the begotten son. But the stories of Moses, the stories of again, the stories of Noah, the stories, you hear the same stories. You hear the same, they repeat, for example, do unto others, you would have people do unto you. Reciprocity is really, in a way, to simplify, because if we lived even by that principle, everybody would be fine, right? If you treat other people the way you want to be treated. So these are the kinds of things that emphasize, and even forgiveness. Forgiveness is better and necessary, but what they do stress, and this is the difference, is when you are oppressed, you have a duty to fight. A righteousness, in other words, fighting oppression is an act of righteousness. It says a righteous man or woman is not cowed down, but defends themselves when they're oppressed. They even have the Black aesthetic in there when it talks about poets, how they wander aimlessly in every valley and say that which they do not, except those who believe and do good and defend themselves when they're oppressed. So we're enjoying, the poets, the artists, the jazz musicians, we're enjoying to fight oppression. Those of us who have been gifted with that as well. So again, it follows a line, and even though I don't get into the history, I talk about the same thing that you see in Buddhism, right? And in the Krishna movement, which says these were two Black movements in that part of the world. So that's where the connection is. And even the Quran says the Christians are our friends. When Prophet Muhammad was having problems in Mecca and they were trying to kill him, they sent the entourage went to Ethiopia. And the Ethiopian emperor of that time believed that this was a prophet and protected them. Right. He gave them asylum there in Ethiopia, and prophet told that Muslims never attack Ethiopia. Right. So you have that, again, that connection. But Jahiz does write about this. He does say that after the Arabs, after they became Muslim, and because the Prophet of Islam, because it's spreading everywhere now, was Arab, they started thinking they were better than the other Africans. You know how that goes. And so he called it racism. It wasn't racism, it was ethnocentrism. That's what I call it, because they were all Black, right? And it got the Ethiopians, and Arabs are just Ethiopians and Nubians. Anyway, that's what they are. And the issue of the Semite, and that's another thing. They call the Hebrews and Arabs Semites. And the Semites and the Hamites were Black. They looked the same anyway. That's not the point. But the point I'm making is that I want to make is they were actually more Hamites or Kemites than Semites, because the eponymous ancestor may be Semite, right? Abraham from Sumer, but the other 95% were Kemites, right? Because they're intermarrying with the Kemetic people in Egypt when the extended family comes into Egypt. And you can trace there was a family, there's a Hebrew Egyptian family called the family of Amram. They talk about that. The Jesus genealogy goes back to that family of Amram. That's why, I mean, we know he's black. And of course, he was represented as black in the very beginning, for a number of years. So I hope that kind of explains the connection. But the idea again, was to break the hegemonic power and colonial oppressive control of the European. Those were the purposes of those traditions. And even when we see it today, when we look at the civil rights movement and the oratory and the language, right? Because they're using a lot of this language, biblical language, Malcolm and King. You kind of see a kind of relationship even there with the civil rights movement, and maybe the way the Christians had to be this because they didn't have the military wherewithal. And then the shift, because we see that just the passive resistance is not enough, and the cultural practice is not enough if the oppressor still has control over your life. Right? If you don't have sovereignty and self-determination, then you have a duty to fight that oppressor and break their power. And that's what happened with Muslims, not to mention the huge amount of knowledge that came out. We need to start calling Western civilization, because it's hardly anything, or need to clarify, it's hardly anything that they're calling Western civilization that did not come from Africa first. Hardly anything. You can go over and over and over, right? The religions come from Africa. The sciences come from Africa. The arts come from Africa. The social movements come from, on and on and on. So what is Western civilization? What is that? They're calling Egypt Western civilization. They're calling Persia Western civilization. They're African. And we're enjoined as Herus to reclaim our heritage, not disclaim it. And a lot of us are disclaiming it. Yeah. And if you don't believe it, look, go to Persepolis in Iran. Go to Parsade and look at what the Persians look like under Cyrus the Great and Darius. Everywhere they went, they abolished slavery and the slave trade. That's a benign empire. And they restored, not only did they abolish, but they restored the autonomy and the temples of oppressed people all over that region. It was one of the largest empires ever. And everywhere they went, that's what they did.
Thank you for that. And I think this is a really good time to just reiterate that what we've been talking about, your new work, River of Prophecy, of which is available right now. And the full title of that, A River of Prophecy, Constructing a Sacred History of African Americans. Thank you for your time. Thank you as always. When people hear you on the program, they often say that they have to listen multiple times because the breadth and depth of what you're talking about on the programs that you have been on with us on Africa Will Know Project and Africa Now has been really enlightening. And this program and our conversation today is no different. It's actually extending and very prescient in this particular moment, very important in this particular moment to really talk about these histories, but also the ability to find, as Amir Baraka once said, unity without uniformity. I think that becomes important too. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing. And we look to have you back again.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me and for doing what you do.